In this video I will state the plot of the film, give my thoughts on the film with a little history, and finally I will give my thoughts on a recent documentary on The Princes in the Tower by Philippa Langley. The plot begins with Philippa Langley in an unfulfilled job in Edinburgh. She loses a work promotion to a less experienced colleague. She unsuccessfully confronts her boss about being passed over. Her ex-husband John, who helps with their two sons, tell her to keep her job as they need the money, but she would resign from her job anyway. She attends the play on Richard and identifies with Richard, whom she feels was unfairly maligned as a hunchback, the man behind the two princes in the tower, and a usurper. She has visions of Richard and begins to talk to this apparition throughout the film. She joins a local Richard III society who believe he was unfairly vilified by Tudor propagandists. Her research shows sources saying he was buried in the Leicester Greyfriars Priory. Other sources state his remains being thrown into the River Soar. After Greyfriars was demolished in the Reformation, Leicester Mayor Robert Herrick had a shrine built in his garden saying, "Here lies the body of Richard III, sometime King of England." Philippa attends a lecture on Richard, meeting Dr. Ashdown Hill afterwards, who is publishing a genetic genealogy of a Canadian descendant of Richard's sister, and he tells her to look for Richard in open spaces in Leicester because people avoided building over old abbeys. While walking around Leicester looking for an ancient site of Greyfriars, she gets a strong feeling that an R painted on a car park is the site of Richard's grave. Philippa contacts the University of Leicester archaeologist Richard Buckley, but he dismisses her idea, but when the university cuts his funding he changes his mind and gets back to her to team up. And they both find an old map of Leicester marking Robert Herrick's property with the possible shrine. They overlay a modern map of Leicester and find that the shrine may be in the middle of the car park that Philippa visited earlier. She pitches it to the Leicester City Council for funding. Richard Taylor from the University of Leicester advises that it's too risky. The council approves her plan, but when ground radar finds nothing, the funding stops. She turns to the Richard III Society to crowdfund for the project, and the money comes in from all around the world. On the first day of the dig, Buckley tells Langley that the dig certificate has been signed, but does not tell her that her name has been omitted. Philippa gets Buckley to start Trench 1 at the painted R spot, and they find the legs of a skeleton, but Buckley thinks it's a graveyard for monks. Philippa confronts Taylor on site for falsely claiming credit for leading the project. She insists on stopping all work to focus on exposing the complete skeleton in Trench 1. Buckley angrily relents and goes home with the crew continuing to dig at that spot. The archaeologist soon realises the remains are that of Richard III, with the correct death blow to the skull, a 30-year-old male, and a curved spine. University of Leicester leaders rush to take over the project and rehire Buckley. In February 2013, Taylor announced their findings to the world at the University of Leicester press conference. They also had DNA done on the skeleton as well. But at this conference, Philippa is sidelined, even by Buckley, who was later given an honorary doctorate by the university. Richard gets a funeral fit for a king in Leicester Cathedral. The closing credits show that the royal family website has reinstated Richard as the rightful King of England, 1483 to 1485, and that he is no longer regarded as a usurper, and Philippa is awarded an MBE for her work. I found the film underwhelming, and I thought it strange that throughout the film they had the main character see and talk to a vision of Richard III. The film is only 108 minutes long, and is very much an A to B summary of the events of Philippa Langley's successful quest to find the remains of Richard III. In such a limited runtime, the filmmakers cannot cover all aspects, and have to condense events to a summary, even though in reality the project took years to undertake. It does show the Ricardian position of wanting to absolve Richard from the princes in the tower, and indeed the film does have Philippa ask the apparition of Richard whether he did it, and Richard does not answer because it would be difficult and probably a bit too controversial to do so. Realistically, we are far too removed from the events, and it would be difficult to prove definitively who did it or not. I think Richard had a motive because he had sidelined his nephews Edward V and another Richard, causing controversy amongst the Yorkists and dividing their camp, and being a military man, taking a straight line approach and bearing in mind in his own lifetime, he saw events such as father Richard of York or Richard of Plantagenet try and depose Henry VI and getting recognised as his heir over that of Henry's son Edward, seeing Margaret of Anjou defeat and execute Richard of York in December of 1460, only then to see his brother Edward IV depose Henry VI, driving Margaret of Anjou and her son Edward into exile. The Earl of Warwick and his brother the Duke of Clarence trying to depose Edward in the mid-1460s and failing, trying again in 1469, being driven into exile and coming to terms with Margaret of Anjou, then coming back and succeeding in putting Henry VI back on the throne, and in turn driving Edward and Richard III into exile for 6 months. Then seeing Edward IV coming back to defeat Warwick at the Battle of Barnet, and Margaret and young Prince Edward, Henry's son, at the Battle of Tewkesbury. Young Edward, the son of Henry VI, along with the nobles who had supported the Lancastrian cause, all perished at the Battle of Tewkesbury, and shortly after this Henry VI himself would perish to a blow to the head, and indeed today you can still see the matted hair where the blow took place. Clarence having changed sides before the Battle of Barnet, and finally 1478 saw Clarence rebel again and this time executed. So it is possible that Richard thought he could rid himself of the problem of the princes, because after all, once the princes had grown up, they in turn could rebel to press their claim and cause trouble for him down the line. There is also the confession of James Tyrrell, but this was obtained through torture and is unreliable. To be fair to Richard, there are other considerations, for example the Duke of Buckingham, who was also a descendant of Edward III, through John of Gaunt and Thomas of Woodstock on his father's side, and through John of Gaunt again through John Beaufort, son of John of Gaunt, on his mother's side. So he had a claim to the English throne, and he did rebel in October 1483 in favour of Henry the Tudor, who was trying to land in England at the same time, so that they could quote-unquote join forces to defeat Richard, but in the end this fell apart and the Duke of Buckingham was executed. The reason this is suggested is because Buckingham, by removing the two princes, was clearing the way, leaving only Richard and at that time his son to deal with if he was successful in taking the throne, which of course he wasn't. A document dated sometime after the disappearance of the princes was found in the archive of the College of Arms in 1980, stating that the princes' disappearance was the vice of the Duke of Buckingham. Michael Bennett suggests the possibility of some of Richard's prominent supporters, i.e. Buckingham and Tyrrell, removing the princes on their own initiative without waiting for Richard's orders. There is also a Portuguese document suggesting Buckingham as a guilty party, stating in effect that Richard III turned them over to the Duke of Buckingham, who starved them, and so on. Buckingham held positions of Constable and Chamberlain of England, so he had access to the Tower. Although Richard doesn't blame Buckingham for the princes even after his disgrace, which is interesting because Richard had the opportunity to do so. There is also Henry's mother, who could have joined in with Buckingham, acting on Henry VII, that is, his behalf, to further her son's claim by removing other claimants to the throne and clearing the way for Henry, although this is doubted by some historians. There is also the possibility of Edward V being ill, because Mancini reports that Edward was frequently visited by a doctor, and it is not impossible for this to occur if you consider the high mortality rate in medieval life, and the fact that slightly after this period, Arthur, the eldest son of Henry VII, perished early in 1503 before his 17th birthday. There's also Henry VIII's illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, who also perished at 17 in 1536, and his legitimate son, Edward VI, he also perished young in the 1550s. And of course, over 125 years later, Henry Stuart, the son of James I and VI, also perished young at 18. All these happened in London. There is another theory claiming to have evidence that Edward V may have lived his days in the Devon village of Coldridge, linking the 13-year-old prince with a man called John Evans, who arrived in the village around 1484 and was given an official position and title of Lord of the Manor. Researcher John Dyke noted Yorkist symbols and stained glass windows depicting Edward V in the Coldridge Chapel, commissioned by Evans and built around 1511. These stained windows could simply be a remembrance for the young prince by a Yorkist supporter, however. The additional problem is Edward was raised to be king. The Yorkists were split over Richard's actions, some of them joining with Henry Tudor at the Battle of Bosworth, and later they rebelled against Henry Tudor following claimants Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck. So why did he not make a claim and his own bid for the throne? He had opportunities to do so. The preservation of his being sure, but others made bids, why not him? And as a rival claimant to the throne, had he been found out, Why did he not occur the ire of Henry VII and the wrath of Henry VIII, who also feared rival claimants like the second Duke of Buckingham, Richard de la Pole, Edmund de la Pole, and Margaret de la Pole are prominent examples, and all were executed by Henry VIII. So it's quite possible that had he been found out, he might have suffered a similar fate, but this research doesn't say he did. So, it's quite a secret to have kept, and for it not to have leaked out. I should note that any new regime, and the Tudors would be no different from this, and considering Henry VII's own thin claim to the throne, does try and spin out how bad and terrible the previous regime was and how righteous and heroic the new regime is. This leads on to the viability of Shakespeare as an historical source, which is brought up in the film, and to be fair, it is actually a good point, because while Shakespeare is a towering figure of literature, his work should not be used as an historical source, because he wrote his plays for the theatre to entertain, not as a history lesson or to be historically accurate, because we should note that the theatre was the Hollywood of its day, and Hollywood history films are by far not accurate. And he was also writing his plays under the reign of Henry VII's granddaughter Elizabeth I, and it would not have ended well for him had he not written his plays showing the Tudors in a positive light. There is another point in the film where the character puts it to Richard that if he had disposed with the princes, then why not Clarence's son and the sons of his sister? Well, Clarence's son, according to some historians, was not of sufficient capacity, so he couldn't be king, and reference his sister's sons, there was the entail and the succession of the Crown Act under Edward III limiting succession to descendants of the male line, which could be used to limit claimants to the throne if enforced, and also the general point that male offspring of male kings would take precedence over male offsprings from any sisters. Had Richard survived Bosworth, he was still a relatively young man, and if his interest in his niece is the case, as has been suggested by some, then there is every expectation that Richard himself could produce other male heirs, because fortunately for him, his own son perished in 1484. It should be noted as a separate point that Philippa Gregory has long theorised the survival of Richard, the younger of the two princes in the Tower, for some time. There was a TV documentary on the 18th of November where Philippa Langley went about trying to prove the princes in the Tower survived. There were 4 documents provided. The first one was a receipt of the purchase of arms, and it mentions a Dowager Queen of Burgundy, Margaret of York or Margaret of Burgundy, who was a sister of Edward IV and Richard III, and the receipt also mentions a son of Edward IV, but it does not mention which of the 2 princes it is. In fact, it mentions no names at all. The second is a document stating the life story of Richard, written in Middle Dutch, in which he left England under the care of 2 Percy brothers, went to Paris, then to Portugal, then to Ireland. The question I did have about this was, if it was written in his own hand, why was it in Middle Dutch and not in Middle English, his mother tongue, or in French, the language of the court, or in Europe, or in Latin? A simple explanation could be that he was dictating to a scribe in Flanders, who wrote it in Middle Dutch. Flanders in this period was under the influence of the Kingdom of Burgundy, and part of the Kingdom of Margaret of Burgundy, so that is a possibility. The show does have 2 experts have a look at this document, and they both state that it's an authentic 15th century document. But as Dr. Janina Ramirez points out, you have to guard against forgeries, and this document being too good to be true and showing exactly what you want to see. The third document is a French scribe at the court of Maximilian, where Richard meets Maximilian, the Holy Roman Emperor, and detailing 3 birthmarks that only Richard would have on his eye, on his mouth, and on his thigh. The fourth document is a contract with the Duke of Saxony for 30,000 florins to be repaid when he was crowned king, that is, when Richard was to be crowned king of England. While very interesting, it should be treated with care on 2 points. One, our own biases. The point that this document proves exactly my point and my view on things. And secondly, while we have to acknowledge the bias of the victor Henry Tudor and his own message and his own narrative and spin, we also have to consider the bias of those who rebelled against him and who saw him as a pretender and as a usurper who had a very slim claim to the throne and who wanted to put a Yorkist candidate back on the throne. Further, the first document, the receipt, in this documentary was used to prove the survival of Edward V, but it doesn't, because it doesn't mention any names. It was used in the documentary to say that Richard was crowned and coronated in Dublin in 1487, and then went on to the Battle of Stoke Field, the last battle in the Wars of the Roses. There is no evidence for this, they provide no evidence for this at all. And additionally, if we are to take the life story document at face value, and for the sake of argument, argue that it's true, could it not be Richard? Because it states that he journeyed to Paris, to Portugal, and then to Dublin. So could, the Dublin coronation not match up with this? And then the army led by someone else, say the Earl of Lincoln, on his behalf at Stoke Field. Could that not be more plausible? And in fact, in 1487, Richard would be 13, not far off the age of the Tudor argument of the 10-year-old being crowned. Now, from what I understand, Richard Simon, who was a churchman and one of the main movers in the Dublin coronation and the rebellion leading to the Battle of Stoke, originally intended to present Lambert Simnel as Richard, Duke of York, before changing his mind, crowning him Edward VI, spinning the idea that the young Earl of Warwick, who had been held in the Tower of London, and indeed would continue to be held in the Tower of London during this period, had somehow escaped, when in fact he didn't. So, again, that is interesting, due to the fact that the initial plan was to sell this coronation as Richard rather than Edward. The downside with this argument is, of course, that Lambert Simnel was captured and pardoned by Henry VII, and was put to work in the royal kitchen, and later became a falconer. The way around this, however, would be, for the sake of argument, that the Simnel Lambert would be a Richard stand-in for the campaign, so the Yorkists would not lose their main card, and that Richard could rebel again. After all, battle was very risky, and everything can turn on a dime. A relevant example in this discussion would be the Battle of Bosworth itself, where Richard III was the more experienced soldier and commander, and he had a larger army, so he had the advantage. But because of events in the battlefield, for instance, the reserve division under the Duke of Northumberland holding back, with Thomas Stanley coming in on the side of Henry, combined with Richard's charge directly at Henry, but then becoming isolated and being then cut down, changed everything in the battle. In conclusion, reference this documentary. Whilst it is interesting, it is not definitive, but what it does do, I think, is open the door for further investigation and research of Richard surviving. I don't think it proves Edward. They haven't done that. They haven't provided anything for that. And as mentioned earlier, there is the potential of Edward V being ill. I think, more research is needed. For the definitive proof, then DNA would need to be done to the remains of the two skeletons found in 1674, and also perhaps the remains found in 1789, when workmen were repairing St George's Chapel, and where they rediscovered the vault of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, with two coffins. Although inscribed with George, Duke of Bedford, and Mary, their remains were found elsewhere within this crypt. So it would also be interesting if the remains of Perkin Warbeck were found, because I believe they were lost, and that was also DNA tested. Now, the reason why this is important is because it would prove whether these were the two princes or not, and therefore opening the door to what was discussed earlier in the video. So that would be the logical next step to then take the argument forward. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one.